The cold bites hardest just before dawn. It is September 19th, 1940, on the streets of occupied Warsaw. A thin mist clings to the cobblestones, rising in slow curls as German loudspeakers bark orders over the rooftops. People stand in a silent crowd, surrounded by helmets, rifles, and the metallic snap of boots hitting pavement. Among them is a man who shouldn't be there. He holds no expression, no tremor, no sign that he has come here by choice. His name is Witold Pilecki, a Polish cavalry officer standing in a formed roundup designed to send hundreds into the unknown. The soldiers push the civilians forward. No one knows the destination. Rumors only speak of a camp to the west, a place from which no one returns. Pilecki's eyes follow the trucks waiting at the corner. He knows exactly what they mean. He knows this is the edge of a mission judged impossible by the very people who approved it. A mission described in whispers as suicide. And yet he steps closer, letting the German cordon swallow him whole, because what waits beyond those trucks is the only way to expose the truth. His legend begins the moment the engines start. The trucks rolled west, leaving Warsaw shrinking behind them as the grey morning opened into a long, silent road. For most prisoners inside, this was the beginning of disappearance, the moment their lives passed beyond the reach of witnesses. For Witold Pilecki, it was the beginning of something constructed with purpose. A mission formed in secret meetings of the Polish underground state, the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe. To understand why a man would walk deliberately into the jaws of a German concentration camp, we must step back into the structure of a country crushed yet unbroken. In September 1939, Poland had been torn apart in a dual invasion, the German Blitz from the west and the Soviet advance from the east. The Polish army fought with stubborn intensity, but by early October, the last organized resistance collapsed. In the ruins of the state, however, a new form of command emerged underground. Officers, politicians, couriers, priests, teachers, they built a hidden network of cells, reports, and armed groups. It became known as the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa. By early 1940, the Germans were tightening their grip on the cities. People vanished into prisons and transports. Yet even among the resistance, whispers about a new camp near the town of Oswiecim, renamed Auschwitz, carried a chill that felt different. Men taken there did not write back. Couriers sent to investigate did not return. The Germans were expanding the site, raising electrified fences and watchtowers, bringing in SS guards with precise brutality. No intelligence reached the outside. The Home Army understood the stakes. If the Germans were building a killing machine, the Allies needed proof. Not rumors. Not fragments of testimony. They needed someone to go inside. That idea alone was severe enough to silence a room. Auschwitz was not a fortress one broke into or out of. It was a black hole in the center of occupied Poland. To send any operative inside was to accept their death as payment for the information they might gather. Yet the resistance leadership drafted a plan anyway, a reconnaissance mission of unprecedented boldness. They needed a man with discipline, courage, and a near-superhuman ability to remain calm under pressure. A man who understood military structure, who could organize people quietly, who could endure torture without breaking. A man willing to step into a place designed to crush the human spirit. Pilecki volunteered before they had finished speaking. He was 40 years old, a cavalry officer from the 19th Regiment, a veteran of the Polish-Soviet War, known for resolve that bordered on serene stubbornness. After the fall of Poland, he had co-founded one of Warsaw's early resistance organizations, which later merged into the Home Army. He knew the Germans. He knew their cruelty. But he also knew the power of information and the cost of letting the world look away from what was happening. So he proposed something almost unimaginable. He would allow himself to be arrested during one of the German street roundups. Once inside Auschwitz, he would build a resistance network, gather intelligence, and transmit reports back to Warsaw and from Warsaw to London. The plan was approved because no better option existed. By late 1940, the Germans were preparing Auschwitz for something larger than a political prison camp. They expanded barracks, increased transports, and laid the logistical foundation for a system of murder not yet fully visible. The Allies had suspicions, but nothing verified. And in the fog of occupation, even full truth sounded like exaggeration. Pilecki intended to cut through that fog by placing the world's first trained, organized intelligence officer inside the camp's perimeter. As Warsaw struggled under ration lines, patrols, and curfews, he prepared in absolute secrecy. Only a handful of resistance leaders knew what he intended to do. If he vanished, no trace of him would point back to their organization. If he died, the mission might die with him. The day he walked into the German cordon was the day the Polish underground took its greatest gamble. And now, the convoy carrying him rattled toward the south, toward a cluster of wooden barracks and barbed wire in the fields of Upper Silesia, toward an experiment in human destruction the world had not yet understood. That destination forms the foundation for the next part of the story. How Auschwitz worked in those early months, and how Pilecki prepared himself mentally for the impossible task ahead. The convoy reached the outskirts of Oswiecim under a fading autumn sky. Smoke drifted in slow spirals from chimneys that did not belong to any factory the prisoners recognized. The engines stopped. Orders were shouted. Rifle butts slammed against metal. The prisoners were driven out of the trucks in a blur of boots and curses, herded toward a gate crowned with a newly mounted iron sign. Arbeit macht frei. It was September 1940. Auschwitz was still in its early form, but its purpose was already unmistakable. The main camp, later known as Auschwitz I, held mostly Polish political prisoners at this stage. Teachers, officers, scouts, priests, and civilians swept into German roundups. Mortality was high. Beatings were constant. Roll calls stretched for hours. The camp commandant, Rudolf Höss, ruled with a strict and calculated violence. Under him, the SS refined systems of punishment, surveillance, labor allocation, and execution. The gas chambers at Birkenau had not yet begun their industrial operation, but foundations were being prepared. The camp was evolving towards something darker by the month. Pilecki stepped onto the gravel, his number 4859 replacing his name. His hair was shaved. His belongings disappeared. His identity, as far as the Germans were concerned, ceased to exist. Whatever he had brought with him mentally was all he had left. And that mental preparation had been thorough. He had studied German patterns of control, methods of recruitment, and the psychology of men under extreme duress. He knew that the only way to survive inside Auschwitz was to understand its rhythms without becoming trapped in them. He would need to observe without revealing intent, gather information while avoiding unnecessary risks, and make contact with prisoners who could be trusted. The Home Army had given him no tools except discipline and a mandate. Build an underground inside a place built to erase resistance. The first weeks were a test almost beyond endurance. Prisoners were assigned to work details, gravel piles, construction crews, transport shifts chosen not for efficiency but for breaking bodies. Pilecki was moved through barracks where sickness spread in waves, where men disappeared overnight, where the SS applied punishments that were both random and deliberate. What he witnessed in those first days confirmed what Polish couriers had feared. Auschwitz was becoming a mechanism of slow, grinding death. Yet beneath the suffering and disorder, Pilecki noted patterns. The hierarchy of capos. The routes between work sites. The guard rotations. The storage areas. The ways prisoners whispered at night between bunks. The ways hope flickered even where life expectancy shrank by the hour. Within 3 months, he began recruiting. He moved with caution, approaching individuals who had shown reliability, calm, and moral clarity. Teachers, officers, scouts, doctors, men who could pass a message without cracking under pressure. By early 1941, he had formed the beginnings of ZOW, the Union of Military Organization inside Auschwitz. It was one of the most extraordinary resistance cells in occupied Europe, an underground movement formed in the heart of a concentration camp. Its objectives were simple but immense: document German crimes with precision. Transmit intelligence to the outside world. Prepare to support an uprising if the Allies landed in Poland. Keep prisoners alive long enough to matter. Reports were smuggled out through released prisoners, relocated laborers, and civilians working near rail lines. From Warsaw, these reports traveled to London. They were among the first detailed eyewitness accounts of what the Germans were constructing. The British greeted the initial messages with disbelief, not because they doubted Poland, but because the scale of cruelty described seemed beyond reason. Pilecki pressed forward anyway, expanding the ZOW network across blocks and work details. He gathered names of SS officers, recorded the numbers of transports, noted the early experiments with Zyklon B in basement chambers. He chronicled starvation levels, beatings, execution sites, and the formation of Birkenau as an expanded complex. All this from within fences designed to prevent even a whispered truth from reaching the outside world. By mid-1942, Pilecki had done what no Allied intelligence service had ever imagined possible. He had built a functioning resistance movement inside Auschwitz, gathering reports of unparalleled importance. But he knew something else, something that shaped his next decision. Auschwitz was evolving faster than anyone believed. Its scale of murder was growing. And if the world still doubted, then the intelligence he had already gathered was not enough. He would have to leave the camp himself. In Auschwitz, survival was not only a physical struggle, it was a moral battleground. For most prisoners, the fight was minute by minute to endure cold, hunger, exhaustion, or the whim of a guard. For Pilecki, survival had an additional dimension. It was the foundation of a mission whose value increased with every day he remained alive. He learned quickly that the camp rewarded brutality and punished dignity. Capos beat men for slowing their pace in work details. SS guards staged arbitrary executions to demonstrate absolute control. Food rations were calculated to starve the average prisoner within months. Disease struck relentlessly: typhus, dysentery, pneumonia carried by lice, by overcrowding, by the lack of clean water. And yet, in this environment engineered to erase humanity, pockets of solidarity formed. A piece of bread shared at night. A whispered prayer. A stolen moment of humor. Pilecki saw that resistance here was not always an act of sabotage, sometimes it was the simple refusal to lose compassion. He knew he needed allies who understood this. ZOW recruits were chosen not for strength but for character. They became a network of quiet protectors smuggling food to the weakest, registering the sick under false numbers to avoid execution, positioning trusted men in the camp hospital to monitor SS experiments. For Pilecki, the survival of others was as essential as his own. A network cannot function without people. To him, every life saved was both a moral victory and a strategic necessity. In the darkest place in Europe, he built a community grounded in courage, restraint, and trust, the human foundation upon which all other angles of the mission depended. Auschwitz was built to contain, break, and kill. It was not built to be observed. Yet Pilecki turned the camp into an intelligence-gathering operation, unprecedented in the war. His network recorded numbers of incoming transports, the origins of prisoners, the names of SS officers, the layout of storage rooms, and the schedule of guard rotations. They monitored new construction at Birkenau, including the first gas chambers disguised as showers. They documented early experiments with Zyklon B long before the world understood its industrial potential. Obtaining this information required a near-perfect balance of invisibility and initiative. Pilecki deliberately placed ZOW members in work details that moved across the camp: kitchen crews, hospital attendants, carpentry units, sanitation teams. These groups passed through critical spaces and saw things ordinary prisoners never witnessed. Written notes were dangerous, a single scrap could lead to execution. So most intelligence was memorized, transferred verbally across barracks at night, and stored in the minds of men who could be killed without warning. When reports needed to reach Warsaw, they traveled with prisoners who were released, relocated, or occasionally assigned to outside labor. A single error could unravel months of effort. Yet the reports reached London, where officials reading them struggled to comprehend their scale. The precision of Pilecki's intelligence forced a reckoning. This was not a prison camp with high mortality, it was becoming a killing center. The tactical brilliance of ZOW was not in sabotage or violence, but in observation. Pilecki built an intelligence network inside a place designed to prevent information from escaping, and in doing so, he helped reveal to the world what Auschwitz was becoming. Most soldiers face danger in battle, but their goal is survival through skill, tactics, or luck. Pilecki stepped into a mission where survival was a near impossibility. His decision was not driven by orders or coercion. It was an act of deliberate sacrifice. The moral angle of his mission is stark. He volunteered to enter Auschwitz. No army in the world had conceived of such an operation. Intelligence services risked agents behind enemy lines, not inside death camps. Resistance networks smuggled information out, not people in. The Home Army leadership hesitated because the plan seemed indistinguishable from martyrdom. But Pilecki understood what few did at the time. The Nazis were constructing a system of destruction that would eventually engulf millions. The world needed concrete proof. And the Polish resistance needed someone whose testimony could not be dismissed. He accepted the mission knowing that even success offered almost no path to escape. His task was to witness, and that demanded the willingness to die anonymously. Yet his sense of duty went beyond patriotism. It was tied to a deeper understanding of humanity. When evil expands in silence, the price of exposing it must be paid by someone. In walking into Auschwitz, he embodied the most difficult form of courage, the courage to step forward when logic points backward, to stand inside the fire rather than outside it, and to risk everything without expectation of rescue. These angles form the foundation for the next part, where the operational, enemy, and psychological dimensions of the mission deepen, and where Pilecki's choices move toward the moment when escape became necessary. What followed next would reveal the angles of this mission, the human, tactical, and moral dimensions that made it one of the most extraordinary operations of the Second World War. To understand the scale of Pilecki's achievement, one must examine the system he infiltrated. Auschwitz was not simply a prison, it was an evolving machine of control calibrated through fear, surveillance, and routine violence. Every element of its structure, from the guard towers to the roll call yards, was designed to break resistance before it could form. The SS Totenkopfverband, the Death's Head units, maintained constant pressure through unpredictability. Inspections could occur at any hour. A guard might execute a man for stumbling in the mud or for failing to remove his cap quickly enough. Punishments were both random and deliberate, creating an atmosphere where prisoners could not rely on any rules except obedience. Information flow was stifled through isolation. Prisoners in one block knew almost nothing of what happened in the next. Work details were segregated. Mail was censored or fabricated. German propaganda insisted that Auschwitz was a labor camp, harsh, but not lethal. Yet, the SS officers were not omniscient. Their arrogance created blind spots that Pilecki exploited. The assumption that starvation prevented organization, the belief that prisoners had no capacity for strategic communication, the focus on external threats rather than internal ones. The guards watched the fences, the roads, and the skies, but rarely imagined that the enemy stood among the people they dismissed as broken. Understanding this enemy system was the key to Pilecki's survival and to the survival of ZOW. He studied their patterns with the detachment of a military analyst, recognizing weaknesses that the Germans themselves overlooked. The enemy controlled life, death, and movement, but not everything. Not thought. Not observation. Not the will to resist. By 1942, ZOW had evolved into an organized structure with ranks, responsibilities, and an expanding network of cells. Pilkey used his military training to create a system of compartmentalization. Each recruit knew only a few contacts, minimizing the damage if anyone was captured or killed. Trusted medics in the infirmary identified men who could endure the strain of resistance work. Kitchen workers smuggled notes. Labor crews observed new construction sites. Engineers quietly mapped buildings and guard positions. One of the most extraordinary aspects of ZOW was its long-term plan. Pilkey envisioned an uprising inside Auschwitz to coincide with an Allied landing in Poland. It was audacious, almost unthinkable, but grounded in real tactical preparation. He imagined seizing weapons from armories, overwhelming guards in select positions, and opening corridors for external Home Army units to storm the perimeter. This plan required knowledge of German routines, stockpiles of stolen tools, and precise communication. ZOW members hid makeshift knives, improvised clubs, and stolen medical equipment. They studied the locations of weak fencing, guard blind spots, and storage rooms that could serve as rallying points. But with every month came new challenges. The camp population swelled with deportations from across Europe. Birkenau expanded. Gas chambers were constructed along rail lines. The scale of killing grew beyond anything Pilkey had anticipated. And the hope of an Allied landing in Poland grew more distant. The operational angle shifted from uprising preparation to intelligence extraction, keeping the camp's truth alive in the outside world. It became clear that to complete his mission, Pilkey would have to do what seemed impossible. Escape from the most guarded facility in occupied Poland, for a man operating undercover inside a death camp. Psychological endurance became a battlefield as real as any front line. Pilkey had to maintain the persona of an ordinary prisoner, exhausted, compliant, invisible, while simultaneously directing a clandestine network under the constant threat of exposure. Each day demanded a careful balance. He had to appear broken without being defeated, submissive without losing control, ordinary without fading into despair. The cost of a single misstep was execution, often preceded by torture, designed to expose accomplices. He carried this burden silently, knowing that trusting the wrong man could destroy everything. The psychological strain intensified as he witnessed the camp's transformation into a center of mass extermination. By mid-1942, transports arrived carrying entire families, Jews from Poland, Slovakia, France, and the Netherlands. Few were registered as prisoners. Most were taken directly to Birkenau's gas chambers. Smoke rose day and night. The smell clung to the wind. Pilkey documented these horrors while trying to preserve his own mind. He wrote later that the camp forced men to confront the bottom of human suffering. Yet he refused to surrender to numbness. This persistence of compassion became both a strength and a source of torment. His dual identity, witness and operative, left scars deeper than any physical wound. By late 1942, his psychological assessment was clear. Staying inside the camp would not contribute further to the mission. The world needed a first-hand witness, someone who had seen the transformation with his own eyes. He understood that the time had come to attempt an escape. Not for his own sake, but for the value of the truth he carried. These angles converge now toward the moment of rupture, the point at which Pilkey, after more than 2.5 years inside Auschwitz, prepared to make the most dangerous move of his mission. Night settled early over Auschwitz in the spring of 1943, pressing a heavy darkness against the barracks and watchtowers. By then, we're told Pilkey had spent more than 2.5 years inside the camp. He had built an underground network, gathered intelligence that reached London, and witnessed the camp's evolution into one of the central killing centers of the Nazi system. But he had come to a stark conclusion. Nothing more could be achieved from inside. Allied governments had received his reports, but disbelief and bureaucratic delay slowed any response. Rumors were dismissed as exaggeration. Some officials assumed that no camp could function at the scale Pilkey described. And so, the purpose that had driven him into Auschwitz now compelled him to leave it. He began quietly evaluating escape routes. The fences were electrified. Guard towers covered every corner of the perimeter. Patrol dogs circled the outer zones. Prisoners attempting escape were shot on sight and their barracks punished collectively. Still, Pilecki observed cracks in the system. Certain work details moved closer to the edge of the camp. The bakery, located near the outskirts, had fewer guards at night. Civilians from nearby towns occasionally passed through. The SS relied on routine, and routine breeds blind spots. Pilecki waited for the right moment. His chance came through the camp's bakery detail, a work assignment treated as relatively stable and low risk. ZOW had already placed trustworthy men there. Among them were Jan Redzej and Edward Cicilski, both dependable, calm under pressure, and physically strong enough for the escape he envisioned. Pilecki needed men who could run, hide, and fight if cornered. But above all, he needed men willing to risk everything with no guarantee of success. The plan was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to execute. The bakery was located just beyond the main perimeter. Its door locks were old, its guard presence inconsistent. At the right hour, with the right distraction, the door could be forced from the inside without alerting the nearest patrol. Once outside, the escapees would face a long sprint toward the tree line, avoiding guard posts, searchlights, and dogs. Beyond the camp lay the Polish countryside, a patchwork of farms, ditches, and frozen fields. The nearest friendly Home Army unit was several hours' journey away. Between the bakery and that safety lay the most dangerous open ground in occupied Poland. Pilecki spent weeks studying the patterns. Guards rotated at predictable intervals. The bakery night shifts were less heavily monitored. If the escapees moved immediately after a guard passed, they would have a narrow gap, perhaps 20 or 30 seconds before the next patrol's line of sight swept the area. The night of April 26, 1943, offered a perfect alignment. A storm front approaching, low visibility, and a reduced guard presence. The wind pushed rain in thin sheets across the ground, muffling footsteps and blurring silhouettes. In the bakery, Pilecki and his two comrades carried out their assigned tasks, waiting for the final guard to make his round. Moments before he approached, they positioned themselves near the door. Their hearts must have hammered against their ribs, yet outwardly they remained steady. A single sign of agitation could draw suspicion. The guard completed his check, glanced inside, and moved on. His footsteps faded. This was their window. Cicilski moved first, applying pressure to the weakened door frame. The warped wood groaned. For a moment they feared the sound would carry across the yard. But the wind masked it. Redzej helped force the door open just enough for them to slip through. Pilecki stepped into the rain-soaked darkness, the cold air hitting his face like a shock. They ran. Not a sprint, not yet a low-controlled dash, staying within shadows cast by the bakery's walls. The guard tower above them sliced the landscape with its searchlight. They froze each time the beam swept past, then dashed again. Their bodies were soaked. Mud clung to their legs. The camp yard stretched impossibly wide. They reached the ditch line. Beyond it lay open ground, then forest. The distance seemed endless, but turning back was not an option. They moved again, this time in a full sprint. A dog barked in the distance. A shout followed. The searchlight swung sharply. The three men dove for the ground, letting the beam pass inches overhead. Then came a shot. It cracked across the night like a breaking branch, but the bullet passed wide. They scrambled forward, pushing themselves to the limit, their lungs burning, feet pounding through mud. No prisoner had ever escaped from this area. The guards were unprepared for a breach, so sudden, so daring. The trees finally rose before them, dark, dense, and offering the first concealment they had felt in years. They disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the night. Behind them, sirens erupted across Auschwitz. And ahead of them lay the final, decisive phase of the mission: survival outside the camp and the race to deliver the truth he carried. The forest ahead was a black wall. No moon. No path. Only the faint silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Every sound, every broken twig, every flutter of a branch felt like a shout in the silent night. But the forest also meant cover. It meant the world beyond Auschwitz. Pilecki leaned forward. Faster. The two men behind him dug their boots into the earth, pushing the stolen German sleigh deeper into the darkness. It was heavy, awkward, built for snow that wasn't there, but it carried the uniforms, food, and weapons they had taken during the escape. Within minutes, they were swallowed by the undergrowth. The wind shifted. A single shot cracked behind them. Then another. Then a burst. The chase had begun. For the next hour they fought the forest as fiercely as they had fought their captors. Branches caught their jackets. Roots twisted beneath their feet. The men stumbled more than once, the weight of the equipment dragging them down. But stopping meant being overtaken. And they knew the Germans moved fast. When a gap opened between a fugitive and the camp fence, the orders were simple. Kill on sight. The sleigh slowed more with every minute. Finally, Pilecki hissed, "Leave it. Take only what we can carry." They ripped open the wooden frame, grabbed rations, took one rifle, left the rest buried under brush. Then they moved again. In the distance, dogs barked faint, but closing dawn threatened from the east when they reached a clearing. Their legs trembled. Their lungs felt raw. But they kept going, knowing the search teams would sweep outward in concentric arcs. Just past the clearing, a figure emerged, a farmer, startled, holding a bucket in one hand. Pilecki froze, finger on the trigger. The man looked at their torn boots, at their shaved heads, at the striped fragments still visible under their coats. He understood everything in an instant. Without a word, he pointed to a barn. Food, water, and a silent nod followed. They slept for 20 minutes, no longer. The farmer woke them with a whisper. A patrol had passed on the road. Horses. 3 soldiers. Moving east. Time to run again. By midday, they were deep in the countryside. The worst danger came not from German boots, but from local Volksdeutsch informants, who would betray any stranger for a handful of marks or the favor of an officer. The 3 fugitives stayed off every road, moving only through ditches and tree lines. Soon, however, another threat emerged. Exhaustion. The men no longer spoke. They were beyond that. Their bodies moved on instinct alone. Pilecki's legs felt like iron heated then quenched in ice, stiff, burning, numb in turns. Every step was an argument between the will to survive and the body trying to fold. But he could not collapse. A message waited to be delivered, the clearest, most detailed eyewitness account of the killing factory behind them. If he fell now, it would remain only in his memory. On the second night, rain began to fall. Cold. Sharp. In sheets. Mud swallowed their boots. The rifle grew heavier, rope slinging deeper into Pilecki's shoulder. They found an abandoned hunting shack and forced themselves inside. Water dripped through holes in the roof. A rusted lantern lay on its side. Pilecki lowered himself onto the wooden floorboards. He allowed himself one thought, just one of the men still trapped in Auschwitz. The beatings. The roll calls. The hunger. The ones who had whispered to him, "Tell someone. Tell anyone. If you get out, tell the world." He closed his eyes for exactly 5 minutes. Then he stood up. "We keep moving." On the 3rd day, they saw their first sign of the resistance. A chalk symbol, a simple geometric mark drawn on the corner of a well. The Home Army used many such codes. Pilecki recognized this one. Safe to approach. They circled wide, waited, then knocked on the door of the farmhouse behind it. An older woman opened it. She stared at them for a long moment, then simply said, "You're expected." Inside sat two men in civilian coats with pistols hidden at their belts. They studied Pilecki's face, his shaved head, his sickly thin frame. The other two fugitives slumped onto chairs. One of the men asked softly, "Name?" Witold Pilecki. Second Lieutenant. Polish Army. The room fell silent. They had heard the rumors a man had volunteered to go into Auschwitz. But rumors were fog. Stories. Whispers. No one had expected him to crawl out of the darkness alive. The man nearest the door finally breathed out. "We need to move you to Warsaw. Immediately." Pilecki's mission was no longer escape. Now it was delivery. Over the next 3 nights, resistance escorts moved them from house to house, barn to barn, never staying in one place long enough to be noticed. German patrols thickened near the main roads. Posters warned of escaped prisoners. Villagers whispered about increased checkpoints. But the fugitives slipped through the cracks, a hidden network carrying them like a current. On the final stretch, Pilecki could see the faint lights of the capital on the horizon. Warsaw, battered, occupied, suffocating under German rule, still held the beating heart of the underground. And within those streets, Pilecki would give voice to the truth he had carried out of the camp. A truth the world had refused to believe until someone escaped to say it plainly. Auschwitz was not a labor camp. It was a machine built for death. And he had returned to break its secrecy open. When morning came, he crossed the threshold of a safe apartment on Panska Street. A kettle hissed on the stove. A lamp burned low. For the first time in nearly 3 years, he sat in a quiet room with a solid chair, a warm wall, and no gun pointed at him. Then he reached for paper. His report began with a simple statement: "I succeeded." But the real meaning of those 2 words was only beginning to unfold because everything Pilecki had seen was about to move outward, into the hands of the Polish Home Army Command, and soon after, toward the Allies who still underestimated the scale of the crimes. The escape was complete. Now came the consequences. The room on Panska Street was small, but it felt vast compared to the suffocating barracks of Auschwitz. The faint hum of the kettle, the muted noise of trams in the distance, even the muffled footsteps in the hallway, all of it felt impossibly gentle after years of brutality. But Pilecki had little time to acclimate. The Home Army Command wanted his account immediately. They brought him paper, ink, and a guard at the door. He began writing before the water in the kettle had cooled. The words came fast, sharp, without pause. Page after page. Dates. Names. Commands. Routines. Death counts. Brutality in its most systematic form. He described the gas chambers. He described the crematoria. He described the starvation block, the torture block, the nightly executions, and the disappearances that swallowed whole groups of prisoners. Every detail he had memorized, every shift in the camp's machinery flowed onto the page. This was not a plea. This was evidence. What he produced over the next several days became one of the earliest and most detailed intelligence reports on Auschwitz created by an eyewitness. The Home Army handlers read each page with growing disbelief. Even they, who had heard fragments from other escapees and smuggled notes, struggled to comprehend the scale. When the final section was completed, the man who collected the papers exhaled slowly. This will go to London. But getting it there meant crossing borders, carrying messages through couriers, radio operators, and coded channels, each link in the chain risking arrest or death. Still, the Home Army had no choice. The information was too vital, too urgent. And what Pilecki wrote was unlike anything they had transmitted before. As the report moved through underground channels, Pilecki prepared for something else entirely: reintegration into resistance operations. He was no longer just an intelligence officer who had infiltrated a camp. He was a witness to industrialized murder. And his experience in Auschwitz had given him an authority no one else possessed. Yet he refused rest. Refused special treatment. Refused even to be called a hero. A physician examined him privately. The diagnosis was simple: severe malnutrition, chronic respiratory damage, and a lingering infection in his jaw from an untreated beating. "You need time to recover," the doctor said. Pilecki shook his head. "There is no time." He returned to underground work within weeks, planning sabotage actions, coordinating couriers, helping other survivors reintegrate into civilian life. But something else hung over him now. A new certainty. Auschwitz was not an aberration. It was a central pillar in what the Germans were building across occupied Europe. His reports had to break through disbelief, both in Warsaw and abroad. By early 1944, fragments of his intelligence had reached London. Polish government-in-exile officials compiled the data, added corroborating testimony, and sent urgent communiques to the British and American governments. But Allied reaction was slow. Too slow. Many officials struggled to accept the scale of what they were reading. Some questioned whether the numbers could be accurate. Others assumed they were exaggerations, the kind that often accompany wartime reports. Pilecki had predicted this skepticism. He knew people would resist believing such horror existed. But disbelief did not change the reality. The killings continued. Inside Warsaw, Pilecki watched the Home Army grow in strength, waiting for the moment when the city would rise. He trained new recruits, met with commanders, and quietly prepared himself for the next phase of the struggle. Yet the weight of his report remained heavy. He had escaped the camp physically, but mentally, he had brought Auschwitz with him into every room, every briefing, every midnight meeting. And he understood now that the consequences of his mission went beyond survival. Everything he had written was a message to the outside world, a message the Allies could no longer ignore. Even as the underground prepared for the uprising that would engulf Warsaw. The truth Pilecki carried was still spreading, page by page, across Europe. And its impact was beginning to shift the understanding of the war itself. But the consequences inside Poland were about to become far more personal and far more violent. Because the world beyond Auschwitz was moving toward its own moment of reckoning. And Pilecki was heading directly into its path. The consequences of Pilecki's escape were not confined to reports and secret meetings. They followed him into the next great storm, the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944. An eruption of defiance against the German occupation that swallowed the city in fire. By the time the uprising began, Pilecki had healed enough to fight again. He joined the resistance units in the city centre under a false identity, Tomasz Serafiński, preferring anonymity to the notoriety that surrounded his Auschwitz escape. He didn't want reverence. He wanted to fight. The battles were brutal. Street to street. Room to room. German armour crushed entire buildings while Home Army fighters held positions with homemade explosives and dwindling ammunition. Pilecki threw himself into the thickest fighting, leading small assault teams, clearing sniper nests, escorting civilians through collapsing basements. Many who served beside him never learned who he really was. He survived for 63 days as the city was pounded into ruins. When the uprising was finally crushed, he was taken prisoner again, this time as a POW under the Geneva Conventions. Sent to Stalag 344 Lambsdorff and later to Murnau in Bavaria. Compared to Auschwitz, it felt almost unreal. There were no gas chambers. No beatings for glancing the wrong direction. No selections. But captivity was captivity. And the war was not yet finished with him. In April 1945, American forces liberated Murnau. The prisoners walked out into the open air, thin, tired, but alive. Most felt relief. Pilecki felt urgency. He immediately volunteered for the 2nd Polish Corps under General W. Ladislaw and as the exiled Polish army fighting alongside the Western Allies. The war against Germany was ending, but Poland faced a new nightmare: the growing control of Soviet forces and the installation of a communist government loyal to Moscow. For Piłki, it meant the struggle had simply changed shape. After everything he had survived, the roundup in Warsaw, Auschwitz, the escape, the uprising, he now confronted a paradox. Returning home meant stepping into another system of repression, one determined to erase the very independence he had fought to defend. But he went anyway. He returned to Poland in late 1945, operating undercover under orders from the Polish government in exile. His mission: investigate the new communist regime's structures, monitor arrests of former Home Army members, and document abuses of power. It was dangerous work. More dangerous, in some ways, than infiltrating Auschwitz. Because this time, the enemy spoke Polish. And it watched everything. Piłki operated quietly, meeting contacts in cramped apartments, writing coded reports, building networks. But the secret police, the UB, closed in. Surveillance tightened. Informants whispered his name. In May 1947, he was arrested. During his interrogations, the communists tortured him brutally. Beatings, sleep deprivation, psychological torment. The scars left by Auschwitz were reopened by his own countrymen. Yet he refused to betray his contacts or recant his loyalty to a free Poland. During one interrogation, he told a fellow prisoner, "Compared to them, Auschwitz was just a trifle." It was not bravado. It was clarity. The new regime demanded total obedience, and it feared men like him, men whose integrity could not be reshaped. In March 1948, Piłki was put on a show trial. The outcome was decided before it began. He was executed on May 25, 1948, shot in the back of the head in the basement of Makoto prison. No grave. No ceremony. His family was never told where he was buried. The communist government tried to erase him completely. But history does not forget men like Witold Piłki. His intelligence reports resurfaced after the fall of communism in 1989. His name returned to textbooks, to military studies, to museums. And the truth he died to protect, the truth he carried out of Auschwitz, became one of the foundational eyewitness accounts of the German extermination system. Piłki's mission had been called suicide. But he completed it. He returned. And in doing so, he carried the voices of millions into the pages of history. Now only one part remains: the closing reflection. History rarely produces figures who move with such quiet certainty into places built to break the human spirit. Witold Piłki was not driven by glory, by ambition, or by the promise of remembrance. He acted because someone had to enter the darkness, to witness it from inside, and to carry the truth back out again. Most people spend their lives avoiding danger. Piłki walked directly into it, first under German rifles, then under the walls of Auschwitz, then into the ruined streets of Warsaw, and finally into the interrogation cells of a new regime that feared the strength of men who could not be reshaped. His story is not one of invincibility. It is one of endurance. He felt fear. He felt hunger, doubt, exhaustion, and despair. But he kept moving in the moments when movement mattered most. And in doing so, he revealed something essential about the nature of courage. It is not loud. It is not triumphant. It is the steady decision to take one more step when the world tells you there is no path forward. Piłki did not live to see justice delivered. He did not see Auschwitz liberated. He did not witness Europe learning the full scale of the crimes he tried to warn the world about. And he did not live to see Poland free. But his mission endured beyond him. The reports he wrote in dim rooms, with shaking hands and a body still marked by starvation, became part of the documentary record that shaped global understanding of the Holocaust. His escape proved that even in the most controlled environment, human will could break through walls designed to be absolute. What he carried out of the camp was more than information. It was testimony, the kind that can only be written by someone who has walked through hell and returned. Today, his story stands as a reminder that a single individual, acting with clarity and purpose, can expose systems of unimaginable cruelty. It shows that even when the mission is called suicide, when the odds are impossible, when the cost is everything, some people still choose to go. And because they do, the world cannot pretend it did not know.